I suppose that we want to set up a poll. All right, we want to find a pretty good poll. All right, so we want to figure out, again, remember, using the 95% confidence interval, which is the rule of thumb confidence interval. Which is, again, what I mean by rule of thumb is that's the one most polls are using, is the 95% confidence interval. We want to figure out, well, how big of our sample do we need? How big of a sample size do we need to get the confidence interval we want? And again, make sure you always round n to the whole number, because we're talking about people typically. We don't want a fraction of a person, so we want whole people only. So before I get to the percents, I'm actually going to kind of go over here and do some scratch work. So remember what the marginal error was, right? Marginal error is equal to 100 divide by the square root of n. Alright, so remember that gives us our marginal error as a percent. We want to solve for n. N is what we want to solve for. And so the first thing what we have to do is, so this is algebra here. First thing I have to do is I want to unbear the n. Alright, so to unbear the n, I'm actually going to take the square root of n times both sides. Alright, that gets rid of the square root of n on this side, so I've got the square root of my sample size times my marginal error equals 100. Alright, I want to get rid of the m, so I'm going to divide by m in this case. And so that gets rid of the m. So now I've got the square root of n equals 100 over my marginal error. I need to get rid of the square root. To get rid of the square root, we take the square. That undoes the square root. Well, whatever I do to one side, I have to do the other. And I have to do the whole thing. So I have to square the whole side. So the whole fraction, 100 divided by my error, margin of error, gets squared. And so the sample size is equal to 100 divided by the error that I want, the percent error, margin of error I want, that fraction squared. Alright, so that's what we're going to have to solve. And so now we're just going to practice that. Alright, so I'm going to practice finding that. So suppose that we want a margin of error of 10%, which would be a really high margin of error, but margin of error of 10%. So again, that's m, margin of error. I want to find my sample size n. And so I'm going to use this. N is equal to 100 divided by 10, that whole thing squared, right? Which this simplifies to 10, so it's 10 squared equals 100. So my sample size in this case has to be 100. 100 people. All right, the next example. Suppose I want to do a little better. I want to get a 5% confidence or 5% margin of error. All right, so again, this is my margin of error. I want to solve for n. Well, n equals 100 divided by my error, that whole thing squared. So remember, it's the fraction squared. You could simplify inside because 100 divided by 5 is 20, and then squaring 20 would give you 400. Alright, so n is 400 in this case. Alright, 3%. 3% margin of error. This one doesn't come out as pretty because 3 doesn't divide into 100 evenly. Alright, remember, this is my m, I'm looking for n, so I'm going to plug this in. I'm going to take 100 divided by 3 and square it. This time, you can't simplify, so you have to type that in exactly. So be careful when you type this in the calculator, make sure it's the entire fraction, in parentheses, and then you square it. Otherwise, you won't get the right answer. And it comes out 1. We run around to the whole person, so it's 1,111 is my sample size. Double check that, but I believe that's what it is. Alright, the last one, 2.5. Alright, so again, that's my margin of error. I want to find my sample size. And so my sample size is equal to 100 divided by the 2.5% error and squaring it. Don't forget to, again, same thing. I'm just going to type it all in one shot. So when you do this, make sure you take the 100 divided by 25 parentheses and then square it. Not 25, divided by the 2.5, which does come out nicely to 40 if you wanted to just square 40, which is 1,600. So to get a 2.5 margin of error, you need to take a sample of 1,600 people to get that good of a confidence interval. Or that good of a margin of error, that small of a confidence interval. Alright, so that's the last thing from this set of notes. So that wraps up Chapter 6. We're all done with Chapter 6.